Okay, so let's everybody in.
Welcome everyone. Great that you're here. When the panel starts, it would be great if you, when you listen in, to turn off your video and audio so that we can that the sound is a little bit better, and also the connection to the video is a bit better. My name is Maaike Gouwendberg. I'm a curator and based in New Orleans and the Netherlands. And this panel I organized with João, Correia. He's gonna wave right now. We initiated this panel something like 2 months ago, when most people went in lockdown for COVID, and it was based on a little conversation of how we thought about how the art world responded and what was happening online, and our worries about how artists are still making work offline. And we got so many questions that we were like, let's share this with more people, and let's start a panel where we invite people from all over the world, to not have like this kind of very European or African or American or Chinese view, but really kind of bring people together to get a broader perspective of how people think about it in the art field. So every other week we have a topic where we speak about, and then we invite different people. And every time that we do the panel, we try to invite someone back, 1 or 2 people, so that there will be an overlap and there will be like this growing network. Today we have 5 panelists, and I'll quickly introduce them. So we have Sadia Rahman from Dhaka. Maybe you can wave. Yeah. She's an independent researcher based in Dhaka, and her work focuses on modern and contemporary art in South Asia, particularly in Bangladesh. She is with us because she's also working, because this week's theme is live art, and Sadia is also working with several artists on future projects that deal with the live component. And she's in I'm not going to say more. Then we have Tutu Gatsibisi. He's based in Johannesburg. And oh, I hear myself now. He is a musical director, a composer, a visual artist, and a physical performer. We met in Performa, and since then we've been talking a lot about like about different sides of performance art. And because he's in Johannesburg right now, but he also has worked with many people internationally, I think he has a very good idea of what the potential is of performance in the time during and after COVID. Then we have Hendrick who is Dutch and based in Chicago, and he is the Ditmer curator for modern and contemporary art at the Art Institute of Chicago. He's the wizard of the performance, but he's very interested in like the body in the space and how the physicality of performance is important for art. So we thought it's important to have him as a voice to really speak about what is lacking right now, and what do you gain when something becomes online, or what happens when the body when the body and the physical space becomes basically the enemy of getting together. Then we have Samson Young. He's based in Hong Kong. Samson, can you wave? He's an artist and composer, and he makes installations, drawings, performances, basically anything that's needed to communicate his ideas. But he also runs a little organization and is organizing already a music festival in Hong Kong at the end of the month. And we work together at Performer in New York. And I think his way of combining video, live art, musicians from all over the world gives a really rich base to talk from. And then we have Fabiana Faleiros. We only see her, yeah, there she is. She's a performance artist from Brazil, based in Sao Paulo. And we wanted to have someone from Brazil because also there the whole tradition to be on the streets, and Fabiana has a long tradition in that, like doing performances like these kind of spontaneous, radical performances on the streets, to bring that into the conversation. And yeah, also her international career is important to have here. I also want to quickly thank the people that were on the former panels, because without them we couldn't have done this. And there are people like Anuradha Vikram in LA, or Ger Haraldset in Oslo, or Sasha Cohen in Turin, and Remco de Blij in New Zealand, and Jalili Atiku in Nigeria, amongst others. And it's just really wonderful to have had their input in the last few weeks. I'm going to give the word to João, so that you can talk a little bit about the theme of today, and then we're going to hand the floor to our panelists. I'll quickly talk a little bit about one example before we do that, and then we can start.
Thank you, Maaike. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. So I'm João Correia. I'm an art historian, art advisor based in São Paulo. And when I was talking to Maaike prior to this meeting, we've been thinking that how much performance became like more and more important in the events, and be it the biennials or documenta. I remember the last documenta we had, I think, a handful of paintings, and we had a whole program of performance. And this is happening in the, I'm just managing the people who are joining as I talk. And this is happening also in terms of the market. And when I was in London, I wasn't far from Helen Ahmad Gallery, which is a gallery that's known for dealing in multi-million-dollar paintings, and they almost treat paintings as assets. They're almost like a bank of paintings. And they were announcing they had a whole program of performance that was going to happen daily, like 30 days in a row. So performance is really coming to the foreground of activity in contemporary art. And performance, I think, in the beginning had a bit of something special. It was an opportunity of being a loophole of the market because it wasn't sellable. Now we're starting to have like art dealers that are starting to sell performance. So it's like one of the questions that we are asking ourselves is like, where does performance stand when it now starts to be mediated by technology? And another thought that came to me was I wrote a paper once on Ana Mendieta, and performance was very special in a way that it could put us into the mirror of our own existence, because like if you enter into installation, if you see a painting, you're not seeing a human body. If you're seeing a human body, that's a very different experience for the audience. Like you feel it in a very different way. And so I grouped we crowdsourced a few questions, and I grouped them in three groups. And so some of the questions with regards to the physical aspect of performance, which is very relevant now that we cannot really have physical contact. The physical and the space became the enemy, isn't it? So this affects performance very much. So some of the questions in terms of the physicality is what happens to the physicality that's fundamental aspect of performance when it's shown online? How can the audience still be touched when using new forms of presenting live art? May we think the live moment online in a favorable way in relation to how it affects the audience? What can we learn, or how can we turn that to our advantage? Then we raised some questions with regards to mediation, with this technological mediation. What does it mean for live art to come to a halt caused by COVID-19? What have we learned about digital life in quarantine that may be useful to rethink the live arts? Will technological mediation maintain or compromise this notion of being in this loophole of the market, as I mentioned before? There are also several artistic questions that are raised, and some questions related to the audience. How is it to be presented in a moment where no eye contact is possible? We can't really look eye to eye through a technological mediation for now, can we? And also now we have a lot of, with the digital, we have a lot of circulation of content and information. Will that decontextualize performance, or will that make local context more relevant? And how will performance be affected by a new world where audience members are online, often creating their own personas? So now, and it seems like to exist online, we have to be active, and once we are active daily online, we end up creating our own personas. Will this influence performance? Will performance be influenced by this? What is this going to be like? So just a few words before I hand over back to Maaike with regards to ARCA. So ARCA was founded in São Paulo last August. And I think if you can make sure you are on mute. And so it's founded in São Paulo last August, and it's run by me with a group of people who are doing great work. And one of the challenges that ARCA wanted to do is to discuss some of these very pressing contemporary themes through art debates, and use, and that's why ARCA, the name comes into that, to use the art as a vehicle to take us, at least in terms of perception and where we are in terms of our subjectivity, to the new world that is shaping. So we've been developing these debates, and locally in São Paulo, we've been developing a few courses. And so that's the introduction of ARCA. And now I hand back to Maaike that will go through some housekeeping notes.
Yeah, so just to focus a little bit of the structure before we continue talking about the theme. The total is 90 minutes, but if you have to, also for the panel people, if you have to leave earlier, we totally understand. We're already very happy that you're here. We want to give everyone like around 6 minutes to quickly talk about yourself, and then talk a little bit about, give an example or manifesto or some questions about the theme. And then we open the discussion amongst ourselves, and maybe the audience can just do in the chat section. If you have a question or a comment, or you want to share a link, you're very welcome to do that, and we'll try to include you in the conversation. But unfortunately, until this time, it hasn't happened because we get so lost in our own stories. And there's too much to share and to talk about, but we really would love to have your questions included. So to go back to the theme of performance and of liveness and of being physically together, I live here now in New Orleans, where I run a residency for international artists. And we often, like every year, we're doing live events. We do like parties. We're always very much together with the community here. And it's very much based also on like living here, being here, learning from where you are, and not so much like you go in and produce something. So it's a very strange situation where we're still in the situation that it's lockdown. We're allowed to do our essential shopping. We have to wear face masks. We're allowed to go for walks. You cannot gather with more than three people, I think. 10, oh sorry, 10 people. You see the city slowly getting alive again, but it's still like totally empty. And it's a city that was always very wild and active and famous for that as well. So talking to my artist about like how are we gonna still be present, or how do we still connect to the community and show that we're here, or like make a connection. The first event that we will do, or like the second actually event that we will do, but I think the first that really connects to the neighborhood is going to be by artist Inas Halabi. And she will make basically a performance in the neighborhood, that with her bike and walking and talking to people along the river, because we're next to the Mississippi River. And then by screening this on Instagram Live, as the audience, you will have a very different experience. And basically she creates a live film. So she really has to think as a filmmaker about the performance, and then also as a person in physical space about how that translates again to people that she meets on the street or where she's going around. So she has to think about all these different levels in a very different way than she ever did before. And for me as a curator, it's an extremely interesting experience and exercise to also think about like what does that mean to and be in the physical space and in the virtual space. So I just wanted to share that as a small example of what also really like how COVID basically inspires us to make new choices, you know, or focus in a different way on someone's practice. But I would first like to hear one of you talk a bit more. So I thought maybe Samson, would you like to start sharing your situation in Hong Kong and how you are personally, and talk a little bit about the things that come up when you think about live performance in this time.
Right. Yeah, sure. And if I'm talking too much and over time, please stop me.
Okay.
So I'm right now in Hong Kong, and that's my home. That's where I'm based. And here in Hong Kong, we are just as of this week, very slowly sort of easing out of the restrictions. So we never had a lockdown situation, but we had some very severe restrictions on public gatherings and capacity in interior spaces, that sort of thing. Schools are closed, museums and galleries are closed, of course. But the galleries and museums are starting to reopen actually this week. But of course, with a lot of new rituals and precautions taken into account. So that's the situation. So myself, I have been able to go into the studio every day and just keep to a routine. But a lot of arts organizations, although the government have officially allowed civil servants to go back to work, a lot of art organizations are still opting for home office. So that's generally the situation in Hong Kong at this point in time. And so I also wear another hat. Apart from my work as an artist, I also run a small sound art nonprofit that is funded by the Arts Council here in Hong Kong. And so throughout this whole situation, our very small team have been thinking about what we want to, like what we miss in terms of musical performances and sound performances in Hong Kong. Obviously, we couldn't have them, but while we were while movements were restricted, we took that time to sort of think about why we missed those events. And also, as the situation unfolded, it became very clear that a lot of the artists that we have supported and worked with before having a very difficult time, and it's hit performance art particularly hard. There's a lot of musicians, they gig and they go from one gig to another. And in terms of cancellation, of course, in all kinds of art, we're experiencing postponement and cancellation, but for performing art particularly, they're basically seeing the entire concert season vanish. And nobody knows when large performances could happen again. So a lot of people's livelihood are affected. So while we were restricted, we've been plotting a festival actually. And we knew in our head that as soon as situation got better, we wanted to be able to put this on as soon as possible. But of course, we have to account for the, let's say, the new reality of social distancing. But rather we thought, okay, instead of seeing this new reality of social distancing as a lag, why don't we try to, first of all, invite the artists to play with that situation of the social distance, but second of all, also think about what of this new situation we might want to retain, or rather what we could, how we could appropriate this situation to make a point. So what we came up with was this a very small music festival called Get Out of Our Heads. It's we are calling it a festival of personalized listenings. And maybe at this point I'll share my screen so everyone can, so you can see. Yeah. So we are doing this with the Hong Kong Arts Center, is a an organization that we've collaborated with. It's basically our regular collaborator, but we've had some other programs canceled, so we relocated some of our funding for this. And so this is a festival where all of the musicians and sound artists that are performing live, but only to one member of the audience. And it's the piece is listened to with the artists in person, but over headphones and over long distances. So at least a couple of meters apart, as social distancing rules would dictate. But some artists actually decided that they were going to vastly expand that distance. So some people were is going to perform on one end of the balcony while the audience are sitting on the other end of the balcony. So as the festival, we of course provide the all of the equipment, but the audience would have to bring their own headphone. And then of course there's all the precautions of sanitizing, checking body temperature before they come in and all of that. And the audiences and the performers are scattered throughout the Hong Kong Arts Center building. And so at any single performance station, there's no more than 3 people gathering. There's a helper from the festival, there's the musician, and then there's the audience. And they're spread out throughout the building. And so each piece about 10 minutes long, and the audience get taken from one station to the other. So we run 2 cycles of it each night, and we do it for 2 weekends. And so all together in total, we are only really performing to 20 people. And so it's a very small number of audience. But we were thinking, first of all, that's just how the situation is going to be. So we accept that. But also, usually under normal circumstances, art organization like ours, we are measured. Our KPI is basically funding level per audience served. And although they never say that is an explicit measuring yardstick, you know, like it's not the only measuring yardstick. It's definitely something that they make you fill in a form for, to basically ritualistically make you realize that they are thinking about that. So, but in this situation, the Art Council is actually probably rather happy that we were still able to put an event on. And so we were also hoping that we were thinking, you know, we don't wish this situation upon anybody, but wouldn't it be great if the Art Council after this, and also popular funding body in general after this, would begin to see number of audience served in relation to how many artists are present in the event, and therefore how much funding we are putting into it. They will see that relationship a little differently.
Yeah.
And just one last thing that I want to say is that in these, as I was telling Michael last night, in these situations, other consideration enter the programming decision too. This is a festival to celebrate making music again safely and while we are able to, but also in a way to distribute some income to artists who's not being able to perform for a while. So we were also thinking about, you know, of the artists we've worked with before, who would be like what would be a good way to sort of distribute that resource. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what we are plotting.
Yeah.
And this is happening at the end of May and the first weekend of June.
Great. Thank you, Samson. It's really, I like your, also your connection to kind of the future and the funders, and also the fact that you really organize this also to give some, yeah, to provide income for the musicians. And I see it here a lot in New Orleans, where basically half of the people is a musician. And you see a lot of Facebook concerts, and people can donate. And yesterday I was with a friend of mine, he's a pianist, and he basically is doing quite well. And it's now going, the only problem now is that they have to go back into the bars, and in the bars people don't wear a mask because they have to eat. So there's like all these extra new kind of fights to be fought, or yeah, I don't know how to say it. Like in the still the physical space is the enemy, even though you think like, oh, we can go back to a bar and play music. Also the fact that with singers, if you sing, you need to have 6 meter distance between people. And I think with brass instruments, it's like 12 meters or something. So it really complicates the whole idea of live performance.
Quick question to Samson from the audience. Samson, are they going to live stream as well, or will it be exclusive to the 20 people present?
Yeah, we are not doing live streaming, so it's a live event mostly, but we've also, the artists are also going to put the composition online on our website, but only those that feel they like, because there are certain pieces where they feel like the live interaction is essential to the piece. And so for those pieces, we won't put them online in our archive. But there are pieces who, there are compositions that doesn't have that concern, and those we will put online after.
Great, thank you, thank you.
Tutuga, would you like to take the mic? I cannot see you because I see so many different faces here in the screen. And So, there you are.
Okay, can you hear me clearly? Because I think I cut out just now. Like,
Yeah, it's very soft. So maybe try to either sit a little bit closer or.
You can hear me now.
Slightly.
Okay, let's try. Wait, let me take these off.
Yeah, this is good.
Okay, good. How are we now?
Good. Yeah, good.
So hi everyone. My name is Tutuga. I'm an artist based in Johannesburg, as Maaike said, and sort of work between theatre and live art, film, composition. At this point, it's sort of whatever will pay. No, I'm joking. In South Africa right now, it's a bit of a strange moment. It feels like we're in a quasi-police state. If anything, we're at level 4. But you're allowed between 6 a.m. and 9 p.m. You're allowed to go outside for a run, a jog, or a cycle. But after that, you can only be traveling if you're going home to work or to buy groceries. In terms of sort of what's happening artistically, like in the country, I think, you know, let me frame it this way, that like realistically, arts in South Africa has always been at the bottom of the pecking order. So when it comes to sort of funding or getting some sort of space to sort of interrogate social, cultural, or political issues, it's always been sort of like the quietest voice in the room. I'll say it this way, like our police, who used to be our police minister or head of armed forces, was downgraded after the Marikana issue, downgraded to be the head of arts and culture. So if that gives you a sense or an understanding of where we're at, then, you know. There are a few sort of, you know, of the biggest sort of artists in the country are sort of trying to do something beyond online reproduction of works or sort of crowdsourcing for funds for future projects. For instance, William Kentridge is now at the Center for the Less Good Idea. He's sort of showing, which is an incubator space for young artists in the country who work within, who are interdisciplinary artists to showcase their new ideas. And the idea or the plan of the center is to not show work that is done, but really to follow your instinct and sort of leading towards the what do you call it? The not so good idea. I can't hear Maaike at all. Oh, and then he's also created the 1 Minute series, which is an online survey of pieces that last exactly 1 minute. And they're all sort of like made for small screens. But beyond that, I think we are in a point of sort of, it's a numb moment, I think, and a lot of people are trying to figure out how to sort of make sense of this moment. I almost think of it in like when Superflex flooded the McDonald's, that we've kind of got this thing. And what is interesting on a positive level is that we've had this sort of like release in terms of what the government was supposed to do between 1994, which was at the point of our democracy, and where we're at now as a post-colonial sort of like post-apartheid society, that all these issues when it comes to sort of social justice, service delivery, community making and building have now come to the surface, and people are really asking, well, why is it taking you over 20 years to sort of like answer our questions of sort of getting sewage sort of cleaned out, or sort of like public clean water to sort of the townships of the rural areas. And in that way, I think it's creating a lot of room and space for artists to really kind of get at the nail of things. Because in South Africa, I think we artistically, the genealogy of sort of like live art in South Africa is framed within sort of like the Western concept of performance art, but encased in all of that is the practices of decolonial and post-apartheid sort of like, well, there's that, and then there's also sort of ritual, spiritual dance, and community-based sort of like making. So, you know, we'll come back to this later when you answer the question of like, what does this mean for sort of like the reception of live art in South Africa or in Africa on the continent. And again, I sort of like to frame that, like, at no point am I speaking of Africa as sort of like a homogenous state. And I think it's very difficult to then answer questions of like being a young South African artist in a
But
global.
how is it, just maybe you have an example that's like more local, now that we have this kind of overview, maybe you can share a little bit like how you, within this quite difficult situation where you have the feeling that everything is numb and that artists maybe are still in this kind of limbo of not knowing where to go. Like, are there things around you that you say like, this is a kind of an inspiring way of connecting back to the community, because the community and being on the street or the ritual is important? Or like, is the example William Kentridge, is that the way to, where you have the 1 minute performance, is that the way to connect again? Or how do you think about that?
To be honest, I don't know. And I'm asking this from my perspective. I live in suburbs in a quasi sort of like Jewish kibbutz. There's 6 houses here. I don't leave my gate. I don't see. The only time I engage with anybody is through my phone or on the screen. So there isn't sort of like a felt experience of what sort of like is happening on the street, because this is how we engage with live art in any way. It really is, you can sort of frame a work, but really what happens when an audience walks in, that's when the work actually happens in a way. So I think the same thing is happening in sort of like the lived experience or the public experience right now, is that like, I cannot make sense of this. I'm in this weird orb, I suppose. And really, I cannot speak for anybody or sort of like the communal art scene here. But I think that like we all experience it in different ways, and that's sort of what makes it as great as it is. But for me, I find it hard to answer that question immediately. Yeah.
That's also very, very valid, because that's the situation, and very important also to know, you know, that we're basically at some point we're stuck, or there is not really a solution yet.
Right.
Maybe Sadia, maybe you can talk a little bit, because we spoke the other day about the situation in Bangladesh and how important the internet is anyways for the arts community. And so maybe you want to talk a little bit about yourself, about your situation, how you feel about it, make it local and kind of a concrete thing.
Sure, Maaike, I can try. I will start before since the segue is use of internet to access the arts, if it's all right with everyone, perhaps I can talk about that first and then double back to introducing myself, probably at a little bit of length, and also talk more broadly about arts infrastructure in Bangladesh and also our coronavirus situation. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
So as Maaike mentioned, we had the opportunity to speak briefly a couple of days ago, and I had mentioned that when I had read through the materials for talking about live art and how presentations of live art or live performances in a particular time and place with certain audiences there, and that kind of quite almost tangible textured experience that can occur in a place, like as the previous speaker mentioned, like that is when it happens, no matter, you know, how that's affected in our experience. And of course I'm not representative, but it occurred to me that being situated in Bangladesh, there's this peculiar thing that happens, that we're very eager to remain informed, and because we're such a crowded country, we're all excessively sociable. But a lot of the ways in which we're informed are the way that's happening now. It's often now in front of a laptop for people who can sort of afford good internet and lots of internet. So we're looking at pictures of things online, we're looking at talks on YouTube, we're looking at videos, and even where there is a sensation that, you know, oh, this ballet was probably more impressive in person, or this Bharatanatyam performance was probably really evocative in person in situ. But the most common way in which we're able to access things because of financial restrictions, travel logistics, visas, or yeah, all kinds of reasons. Anyway, just in normal life, is often through some intermediary medium, whether it's a book of photographs or a news report, or some digital format on the internet. And that's been the case for quite a while, I would say. And the internet adds toolkits and conveniences to that, but of course, and of course, it's a great step up. I mean, if one wants to learn about music or the ballet, it's much better to have YouTube than it is to have books. So it's not necessarily new, but I just want to add to that, you know, having an ability or having a framework within which one reads recordings or testimonies or documentations of other people's performances hasn't necessarily provided us with the experience to use these technologies to construct or create the circumstances to allow that emotional experience to happen in a digital form or a print form, you know? And I think that since our government announced a lockdown for us, I think on the 25th of March, so it's coming on to 2 months now, and a few people I think had started isolating a little bit for various reasons in the fortnight before then. So I've watched a lot of artists who I know, and even artists who I'm only mildly acquainted with in Bangladesh, begin to explore that. I mean, explore their personal feelings of it, and explore what potential there is for sketch programs or other things for making work, especially for people who are not just separated from society, but they're separated from, say, their pottery studio or their sculpture studio, or you know, whatever space they have to work in or practice in, what they can do. And it's almost like a new beginning, a new exploration that's happening at this time, and how that will develop for different individuals or groups as ways of, someone I was speaking to a couple of days ago was talking about, you know, reconsidering the power of ways of showing, because he'd been forced to. He's an artist who has also, throughout his career, almost since he was a student, had a very active engagement in exhibition practice as well, not just for his own work, but like working with collaborators and also now he's in his 50s. He runs a space in Dhaka where he invites artists to make shows, and he's actively involved in that throughout the year. He'll do about 11 shows a year. And so now he's at home, and he connected through Facebook Live. Yeah, Facebook Live, which didn't have this two-way facility. And it was the first time he'd done a Facebook Live. And I could tell that he felt that it was a bit flat because he couldn't see people and they couldn't speak back to him. So how that will develop, or what questions even can be articulated for us, as in what questions about how this is affecting live art practice in Bangladesh. I feel that we're in that incipient stage at the moment, and I'm watching people working it through, just like I'm you know, trying to work it through, because I'm in a situation where I'm having to rethink how I would have done my own things.
You are,
yeah.
So just to interrupt quickly, you're also working on a future project where a live element is part of.
Yes.
How do you think already about how COVID or the near future is influencing that? Like, how do you start thinking differently about like how you would deal with the audience, or how you would put, how you would think about this live element? How would you share it with the audience, or how do you think about how people come into the space? Or is it already in your mind right now, by developing the project, that new regulations have to be taken into account?
That's really interesting. Thanks for asking me that. I think there will probably be a few different things that we will have to consider. One will be whatever regulations the government announces for public gatherings. So one thing that has happened is there's a show that Maaike is referring to it's a bifurcated performance. So it was planned as a one-time performance that has one iteration. Originally we had thought April, and then another iteration perhaps 3 or even 6 months later, and the time would have a specific significance. We would select it, but the performance is about our cultural experiences of architecture, our relationship to architecture, and also of modern architecture, I should say, and also the conceptualization of modern architecture in this region. There was a movement called regional modernism, so that's something that we were interested in. And also the side of the performance is a work of architecture in itself, which happens to have been made by an architect who's quite well known and has won awards internationally. So it's not a site-specific piece, but there are these specific interconnectivities between location and the experience that we were trying to set up. And already embedded in that before the lockdown happened was we had an idea of when we invite the audience to attend, we would like to not create a personalized experience, but create an environment where the audience can enjoy it in solitude. And the artist and I had already, for other reasons integral to the work itself, been talking about how that can be done. And interestingly, the reason that it was necessary for us to have that discussion in a way was because of how social and how socially driven even the way in which we experience art or go to events. So, people will go with groups and, you'll want to share it with friends and have look at things and chat while you're looking at things. And that's very common here. I mean, people being silent in art galleries and not touching things is generally not the way things are done in Dhaka. So, so we had been talking about it, and then we were in this bizarre world situation where this illness was spreading across the globe, and it seemed that a lockdown would most likely have to be implemented at some point. And then in a way it was kind of convenient that we talked about these separations. But that having been said, of course, the first thing that we did was we postponed the show kind of indefinitely, because at the moment we're not in a legal position to organize a public gathering, however small it might be, because we're in lockdown. So that's had an impact. When we can do the show, I feel that for this show, there really isn't that much scope to modify it deeply. And
it sounds like if you thought about it already before, even without knowing it. And it sounds like you already have it in mind, like how to deal with a smaller audience or how to make it personal.
Yeah, and also to separate the audience up. But for our other programming that we also have planned, I mean, certainly the work that I have been planning with a few collaborators here, it's been very focused on doing quite almost hyper-local exhibitions where one is physically spending time in a community, meeting new people, finding locations, establishing places, visiting with artists, developing it over time, and then traveling it. And how to transfer that or do that in this kind of situation, or with this awareness after the lockdown is lifted of, we need to be more physically apart from one another. We need to travel less. And so how does all of that previous thinking that I had, because I still think the questions are relevant, but the solutions that I had put in place, I feel, clearly now need to be reconsidered, And I think that's...
I have to cut you off, I'm sorry.
No,
but they're very relevant, and I'm sure we can talk about it later as a group, because those are very relevant things as well. Hendrick, I would like to ask you, because I thought it's nice how Sadia talks about the architecture, and then you being very interested in the relationships basically between the body and the architecture, and you're such knowledgeable about performance worldwide. So I'm really interested to hear how you deal with this situation where, from your practice as someone who is so deeply involved with artists, and you work on such a long-term projects with them to create physical experiences for an audience.
Thank you, Maaike. Just checking if you can hear me well like this. Yeah. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for checking in. I'm Hendrick. As Maaike already kind of said in the beginning, I'm the curator of contemporary art at the Art Institute of Chicago. Maybe that's also a good way to start it. I'll be speaking from a perspective as someone who's embedded in a large-scale art institution, but also someone, you know, where it's necessary to build a critical sort of like relationship to that. So that's kind of going to be my point of view. I'm also speaking from Chicago, the most American of American cities, so it is said. And we've been in a light form of a lockdown, if you will, where we can still go out onto the streets, but we're in week 9 of a situation where basically only the supermarkets are open and no assembly at all of people is allowed. As you have no doubt all seen on the news, we'll be in this situation for a while still because it is America. Although I'm fairly sort of confident that the state of Illinois is taking a fairly like responsible course of action towards a possible reopening, hopefully over the summer. When the Art Institute of Chicago will reopen is completely unclear because we are sort of dependent on the situation, obviously, but also sort of dependent on the regulations of the state and the city. So maybe as an opening statement, I want to make clear that all my energy, all my thinking has actually been focused on to think about how we can reopen, how we can think in the physical world. So maybe not so much focused on sort of the virtual. And by this, I mean, I don't want to be sort of the Scrooge of the post-internet world or something, but I firmly believe that so much information gets lost in the virtual. However much I appreciate the situation, the opportunity to see and speak to you all here, a lot of physical information is not sort of registered in full. I mean, for all you know, I'm sitting here in my underwear, which in real life would be kind of a valuable thing to know, I imagine. So, you know, like this kind of like physicality, I believe in it. I build a large part of my practice on it. And so one approach is also, which is, you know, something I'd like to do anyway, is to actually speak during a lot of artists at the time, artists that I've worked with, that I'll be working with in the future, to really understand what their practice means and sort of develops, if you will, according to the situation that we're living in. And just to kind of take a bit of a more abstract view, I imagine we were all working on things, whether it's an artwork, an exhibition, a festival, we've all, you know, thinking ahead and sort of thinking about the future. And I have felt sort of personally that it is very essential to reconfigure our like relationship to everything we thought we were doing. And I don't really only mean this on a physical level. We have to think about sort of a choreography of sort of avoidance, if you will, when we reopen, but also on a psychological level, how is that going to feel? But also on sort of a content level, like what is actually important to think about now, what is at stake? Because certainly in the States, you know, this situation has fully exposed, if not sort of exacerbated, massive inequalities in like a society that were, of course, always already there, but now have come to the front to such an extent that, you know, institutions, artists, practitioners, we can't ignore things anymore. It's just kind of simply impossible. But also, and that's what I really appreciated hearing from Samson about, sort of the economics of it. How can someone like me, working in an institution that has economic sort of power to a large extent. Of course, think about the economics of a situation where artists actually also need to redefine the sort of economy of their sort of practice, and how can we actually become part of those sort of conversations rather than dictate the terms. So that's a couple of like more abstract things that I'm working on, and also really believe that institutionally speaking, and again that's sort of the sort of a perspective, if you will, that I'm speaking from at the moment, there is really something at stake. I mean, as we all know, like performance and live art for institutions is a time, labor, and money sort of consuming endeavor that is often, unfortunately, put next to sort of a comparison. Yes, but an exhibition brings in, I don't know, thousands of people, but this, you know, $100,000 a performance or whatever only brings in 500 or 1,000. So things are, of course, like judged in very different ways. And so I do feel there's truly something at stake here. Like, will this, I mean, I'm speaking from a doom scenario, and of course I'm working very hard in my institution to prevent such thinking. Will sort of performance be sacrificed in this situation in favor of sort of an object-oriented sort of thinking again? Because, you know, it's dangerous, it's costly, it's a lot of things. So I think everyone working in organizations needs to become really aware of sort of the discourse, both in society and for the sort of organizations that we work for, which measures are being taken, and if they're actually being sort of taken for the right reasons. So that's something that I want to highlight as well. And I also want to maybe emphasize, before I jump into sort of a practical sort of example, maybe of something that I've been thinking about, that like performance is by no means a homogeneous thing. And therein exactly lies sort of the potential of rethinking practices. I mean, we've seen performances, of course, in various media, you know, like dance, music, kind of, you know, more sort of, let's say, a performance focused in a visual arts history. There's so many forms, but also so many formats. I mean, historically, sort of a performance has existed as an event, you know, something that you show up for, and that does include sort of a gathering of people. But over time, like a performance has also been sort of developing into formats that are more kind of durational, or even functioning as an installation. I'm thinking about, you know, artists like Hasabi or Imhoff, who have really been playing with these installation type of performance. And to be honest, that's where I'm getting my inspiration from at the moment. And like from people like Samson, actually, who are really rethinking like these formats at the moment. Like, how can we still bring together people in space in a form of a performance that really starts to function a bit more in that visual and sort of spatial economy of an installation, where we can actually invite people into space over a longer span of time, rather than, you know, let's say for the coming year, it will be very hard to invite 500 people in one space to show up for an event-based thing. So these are kind of like encouragements, really, sorry, on my part, to think of the incredible wealth and histories of a performance that we have built up over the past, let's say, 100 years, and to really use that wealth to think about sort of the possibilities for the coming years, and to not see sort of a performance as a sort of homogenous entity that can't happen at the moment, because it can absolutely happen, and everyone sort of who tells you not, you know, maybe not for you, you know, but for me, it can absolutely happen. So I was working on a couple of performance projects or exhibitions, really, because I'm also thankful that the Art Institute is at the place to call that an exhibition at the moment, for the coming year. I feel, I mean, you can look it up, what I was working on, but I don't feel super sort of comfortable mentioning the name of the artist, because to be honest, these things are in flux at the moment, and I don't want to kind of anchor it too strongly for them. But for instance, we were thinking about one performance that was supposed to happen in April of this year, which will now move to the spring of next year. And, you know, that is one performance that we're really rethinking as an installation. let's say rather than 6 times, so we were thinking about that it would happen 6 times for half an hour, the artist is thinking about the looping of a performance to make it sort of a more durational event where people over time can show up. But I mean, in addition to the loop, which Claire Bishop, of course, has wrote a really beautiful sort of article on in relationship to Hasabi's work. Like she's also thinking about installation formats. How can the sort of the performance that she's thinking about have moments of quietude where maybe not so much happens and moments of sort of intensity. So yeah, really sort of a paradigm of a performance that kind of like spreads out over time and space, but is still being able to sort of take place in the space and in the sort of condition that this artist is hoping for. I mean, another project, you know, is more of a sad story, to be honest, because you know, we had sort of a budget for this, which was basically slashed in half. So, you know, it's basically back to the beginning and say, I'm not a fan of then saying actually, oh, what can still happen of the original plan, because you're going to wind up with a version that you're not really happy with. It's time to really rethink it then. Like, okay, you're in this like sort of a situation now. How can we basically go back to sort of the drawing table, to use the American phrase, to kind of, yeah, use this as an opportunity to really do something that matters now. And thankfully, this artist, even though it was a bit of I mean, it was a letdown, of course. Everyone needs to cope with loss. Everyone needs to cope with kind of sort of the melancholy of a situation where life is not as you would hoped it would be. But I'm very encouraged by this artist saying, okay, let's do this. Let's actually see what can happen. And one format that I've been thinking about, which is again a space of opportunity for institutions, and sorry I'm rambling, and after this I will stop, which is a space of opportunity for institutions, especially in the States, where institutional collaboration can take on much stronger forms, I believe. Let's say if we invite artists to the city of Chicago, can we invite them as sort of a consortium of institutions where we actually allow their work to sort of develop over multiple spaces, rather than the Art Institute only owning whatever, you know, only showing this artist. I mean, I'm speaking out of turn because, you know, this is not happening yet, and we'll see if it will happen. But I do think there's a lot of sort of potential to really look at how institutions work and what we can do for artists, because that should be the center of all of our thinking, really. So I'm gonna,
I think
I'm gonna stop there. Yeah.
Thank. No, I think you said some really important things, like if the performance will be sacrificed, and then also within the institution to immediately think about the practices that you can, or how you can change performance into something that is still physically experienced by the audience, by making it more into a loop or an installation, or even thinking about the authorship or like the ownership of the piece. I think that's super valid. Really, thanks for that. Fabiana, you're under a very interesting name on Zoom, which I think is already half of a performance. You're a performance artist mainly, and also I know you do a lot of research and write and everything. Yeah, talking like from Hendrick being in the institution, I know you very well from being kind of the activist, street artist almost, intervening in public space. And you also show a lot of your work online. We can follow you on Instagram and see what your kind of your actions are with different personas. So maybe, yeah, I'll give the mic to you.
Yeah, thank you, Maaike. Well, I'm Fabiana Faleiros. I'm an artist and a researcher. And now I am here in my artist residence. That is the library of my mother. So I am, you know, I was in the beginning of the pandemic, I was thinking a lot about this background that there isn't some kind of life, that is a lot of books, you know, like. So in March, I came to my parents' house in the countryside of São Paulo. And actually here I'm doing a lot of emotional work here inside, like the family house. So trying to homeschooling my nephew, and trying to keep my parents at home. So it's a bit difficult. And I'm also trying to apply some emergency applications that in Brazil is totally connected to the private sector. And so, the situation in Brazil is very difficult because of Bolsonaro. He's like combining fake news with populist strategies to keep people on the streets. And we don't have enough tests for coronavirus, so it's very hard to know the real number of cases and deaths here in Brazil. So since 2015, I was working in a project because Maaike, I started to stay more inside institution, also working with autonomous spaces. But then I started like to create my own bar in 2015. That's the master bar. Oh, yeah. And then it's a lot about this gesture that in Portuguese we say desmunhecar, and in English maybe to be camp. And in this bar, it's like an installation. I work a lot with electric performance, music, and objects. And I talk about the capitalism screen and how the sensitive is the screen and not our bodies. So I think we have been like training this kind of online life, last 10 years maybe. And in Master Bar, I also think how it's the gesture of making is totally connected to communicating. So because we are like, when you need to do something, you use your hands and you need to communicate. So there is the physical gesture of making is like, we are a kind of changing our cognition in a very strongly way with the world. So I spend a lot of time with this project, and now I start to develop another one that is also with lecture performance and storytelling that I call the Gossip Seminar.
Gossip?
So,
gossip. Great.
Gossip Seminar. So in the Gossip Seminar, like this word, it's one word from the academic knowledge, like seminar, and gossip from like that comes from networks of women that create knowledge. And how what happened when I bring it together, these two words, and I try like to disassemble this colonial and patriarchal fiction about like gossip became a pejorative word, so it was not like that. It was the word means like a friend. So then after the witch hunted, it came like the pejorative word. So now what I'm working now is with I'm creating an online study group about how we can think fiction, not exactly like a thought that are only illustrating another thought, but as a thought itself. And before the pandemic, I was writing a postdoc project, and it's very connected to, because I was always trying to don't depend so much of the art circuit. And if I get like a grant for a postdoc project, I can stay more time researching issues, and for me, I think it's better. And then my project is a lot about dreaming and how to create a difference between, let me see here, between if your dream is about intuition, or if it's a paranoid or desire. So I think I recommend this exercise for life and for this moment. I think I'm trying like to connect, to be in connection with my dreams in this moment.
So what are the three categories? Intuition, desire, or paranoid?
Yes. I
All
recommend
three at the same
it's
time.
difficult. What?
Or at the same time.
Yeah, it can be also, but I think like the intuition is a place that's very connected to the extraordinary thoughts, but we should like to stay with the intuition more in the normal, for the new normal life.
The new normal. Should we open up for questions, like between you two, if between the panelists? Do you have questions for each other? And I have lots of questions, but I'll wait. I'll give you a preference. If Tutuka, yes. Do you want to? Oops, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I suppose it's just a throwaway or throw out question. It seems like we're sort of like demarcating a moment. This is sort of like not serving as a catalyst, but an actual divider between then and now. And sort of like there's language sort of being brought up about sort of like the new world. I think it was part of the question, the thing that you brought up, words. We'd spoken about how will performance be affected by a new world, right? For me, I have questions around sort of the language that we're using alongside COVID and how that is potentially structuring how we make sense of how we're going to move forward, and how this is potentially affecting you as curator or artist, and what language or what internal language are you then by way creating for yourself to make sense of all of this? Because I think that, like, you know, speaking of Fabiana was speaking about design, blah, 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 and the subconscious and going into that space to really try to make sense of the conscious. There's sort of like, call it like a spectrum of sort of language that has been created to sort of really make sense of this. And I'd be interested to hear anybody's thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to respond. I think you're totally right. Like, the language around this is really important. I would just kind of like to say two things in response. Is that first, that, yeah, this whole notion of, let's say, the new world, like, you know, that this would sort of inaugurate kind of a new sort of paradigm. I don't fully believe in that. It's more that any moment of profound crisis will accelerate things that are already going on in society. You know, so that's why it may feel like sort of a paradigm shifting moment, because everything comes to the fore that probably was already kind of lingering sort of below or on top of the surface. What I do find really unique about this situation, it is one of the first moments in my sort of career and sort of lifetime, really, even, that, let's say, the heart and the inner structure of what I do, namely sort of being in sort of a public organization, and this sort of public is really important, sort of complex word, obviously, to me. That has sort of temporarily, sort of physically, sort of taken away. Like, the doors are closed. You know, like, we are not allowed to, you know, let people have access to a building that would normally function as sort of a public space for us, where we sort of and artists, exhibitions, sort of everything. So in that sense, it has brought to the fore this question of what does it mean to be sort of a public institution or publicly acting figure, let's say, in a time where access is so limited.
Great point. Yes, you know, Hendrick, I had a conversation with a lady. She was like a head of research for the Tate in London, and she was saying that it was important for institutions to start to work more as networks between themselves and with the public and with artists. And so I thought was an interesting consideration, and she said it was urgent. And then for me as a Brazilian, and we always live with this sort of decolonization of culture, like mode in our thoughts. I was thinking, well, the institutions, one of the first things they would have to do is to let go of some power and some authority. Are they prepared to do something to do that?
Well, if anything, it's a time of sort of vulnerability, and I've found some of these Instagram live sort of conversations really interesting that happen between, let's say, institutionally oriented sort of curators and artists, because normally it's such, like, you know, institutions kind of open themselves up or open the doors to hosting artists. And sometimes these situations feel like the other way around, like an artist is now hosting this, you know, kind of institution or so this person in their space. So it's a really interesting way to think about kind of shift in hospitality and sort of reversals of space as well, in that sense.
I was wondering whether I might add something. Actually, it's a question ultimately related to this question about, or this interesting perspective that Hendrick just gave of Instagram as an example and Instagram Live as an example, Instagram being a place where many different kinds of artists doing many different kinds of work have moved to show and share and discuss. And it's been informal, even though it's entirely a corporate owned and controlled space. In the case of Bangladesh, there's another underlying kind of structural difference that's not physical, which is most of our art institutions are private. And because they're private, they're afforded, you know, they're not regulated. They're not regulated in the way that publicly owned institutions are here, or newspapers are here, or print media is here. And in our case, the internet is also regulated. So there are laws that make talking about certain things in certain ways, even asking questions about certain things, actionable. And I mean, I'm not suggesting any causal links or anything, but it creates a particular kind of sort of decision framework that artists have to go through when they make choices about to what extent their practice can extend to a space that's regulated in those forms. And I wondered, I mean, I have a lot of questions about this. I don't have a lot of solutions other than being, a lot of people in this situation, a lot of what I would normally think of as my community, but of course, you know, we're all part of one another's communities. People actively have to make choices. And I was wondering whether anyone else is experiencing that or going through those thoughts for themselves.
Would you have an example of this decision framework, an idea that you were thinking and that somehow you had to tweak it to fit regulation? Or?
Well, I mean, there are certainly, there are ongoing situations of people who are facing action for not just things that they've posted publicly on social media, but for screenshots of private messages that have somehow been taken and circulated. And in some cases, you know, people have been arrested. And it's not one or two people, it's, you know, in the three figures, in the low to mid three figures, which is still significant. And even though a lot of these actions may not proceed to prosecution, or if they proceed to prosecution, it won't necessarily be successful. It can be 3 months or 6 months or a year or 2 years of a person's life. And there seems to be a relationship between how robust someone's support network is and how quickly one is able to extricate oneself, or to the extent to which one is able to extricate oneself to these circumstances. So to anyone who's doing any kind of work that involves questioning elements of how things are done, how institutions work, who's being serviced and who's not able to access service, I think does go through this process of asking questions of themselves before they make a choice to put something online. And I feel that we can't be the only country that's going through this, and we can't be the only country in which cultural actors are, being in a position where how can I put this? Because I'm very respectful also. I mean, I'm very respectful of artists or writers or curators' attempts to say, no, I'm clearly self-defining myself as a non-political actor. And I think I probably fall into the category of people of saying, how is that a thing? I mean, that's a fiction. How is anyone a non-political actor? But there are many people whose actual work and the experiences of their work I respect very much and value very much. But a big part of our art practice and our practice of culture does involve seeing the work of people or working with people who are at pains to define themselves in non-political terms, because they feel that that's necessary in order for them to continue to have opportunities to show, to continue to feel that if invited audiences will come. And it's actually something that becomes a more pressing requirement if one wants to access public infrastructure than when one wants to access or corporate infrastructure that's publicly listed or publicly freely available, like Facebook, than it was when we were showing in private spaces or even if they were private galleries. So in that sense, there's a kind of loss that our community is dealing with there, because we had a solution for a particular circumstance, and we currently are working without that solution, and we're not quite sure how we're going to get it back, and if we get it back, how we will continue to invite people to come and see works that perhaps do ask questions, and you get away with it because it's not in one of those regulated spaces of print or the national system or the internet. And I just wondered whether anyone here also has personal experiences of that, or examples of how that can be addressed neatly or effectively in the case of also something like performance art, which isn't, it's not, it's something that it's, unless an artist is actively working with extremely subtle work, it's very moving, it's very present, it's very there, and it's being done in front of people. I mean, you can't censor it. I mean, you either self-censor it before you've made it, but you can't censor it when it's out there. I'm sorry, I don't know if I've been able to really put that in terms that translate well. I've just put it in the terms in which we discuss it when we're discussing amongst ourselves as people who are in the circumstance.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's like basically how to address or get around these limitations, isn't it? And,
but without compromising on the work or the work of the artist.
I think it's a very good question for a whole debate. Like who has access to what, and where are the inequalities, and how do we deal with this? But it's, for me at this moment in this debate, it's a too large question, to be honest, right. Because it's I think we all think about it, and you're so good in pointing out the different levels of the complexity of the artwork, you know. But I think we could maybe do one more question between the panel
Maybe,
members. And then
should we do maybe our final notes, and then whoever wants to continue, we continue an extra 10-15 minutes. And what do you think, Maaike?
That's also fine. I can imagine that people have to leave because it's already 1.5 hours. So, or let's do a little round that everyone can say a last word, and then we round it up with that. And then you can close it. Wow.
Yeah, could be. So do like we do a round of final considerations, and then we close it.
Maybe we start with Fabiana.
Yes. Now I can see my name on the. I don't know why. Sorry, my name is Fabiana. Yes, but
if you want to say 2 more words, do it. Otherwise, we just round it up. If you have last thoughts or something.
No, I'm also thinking about the technology and how our eye never when I'm using the cell phone, if I'm looking at you, I'm looking at me. So please let's do this exercise. And if I look to the camera, I'm looking, you are seeing my eyes like directed to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm also, I was thinking about how the technology is like changing the way we relate with our bodies. And I would like to say something also about there is a question, may fast global circulation during lockdown discontextualize performance or globalized contests, and how will performance be affected by a new world where audience members are online, often creating their own personas. So I was thinking about how it's gonna be, like, for example, I am in Brazil, and if I'm going to participate of some exhibition in Europe next year, I don't know, I will be taxed. I need to be taxed for coronavirus maybe. So I'm thinking a lot about how the distance will be maybe bigger than we have now about the global south, you know. So I think it's not maybe it's not will be a globalization of the context of the performance, but maybe the inverse situation.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe thinking about the future.
That's a very nice, that's a very smart, sharp thought. Thanks for that. Samson? Any last words, or you want to leave it?
I'm okay. Just really quickly, support your local small to mid-sized organizations. Support artists' Patreon page. I'm sure you've been seeing many of them on social media. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Tutuga?
I think I'm sort of, I'm still, I would sort of rather say that, like, beyond sort of what Samson said, which I think is kind of beautiful, that really there needs to be a sort of want to sort of push further. in my head, this is probably me telling myself, but like there's a want to sort of just get out the gate and push the agenda. And I suppose I'd rather pose like sort of how can we further adapt art, and how can we further scrutinize our logic on constructions to be even more vigilant of sort of some of these systems that have been sort of directing how we make thoughts as artists. I suppose, you know, again, this is me myself, but using you as audience and sort of using you as a witness to all of this, and hoping that that would sort of instigate something to sort of make this happen. Yeah, I'm kind of keen to see what happens next.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hendrick, maybe.
Yes, I'll I mean, also just to say thanks actually to you both and everyone who was part of this. It was really a great time for input. Let me just kind of end before go back to sort of the grind of the day with something that has worked for me. And I guess we all find ourselves in a situation where we're having a lot of sort of conversations, you know, on various platforms with friends and peers all over the world. And in the beginning, in the couple of first weeks of, let's say, our sort of lockdown situation, I found that, you know, like 3/4 of the situation, of the sort of a conversation was consumed by sharing how are you doing and what you're going through. It's really, I'm not denying that, but I've noticed in myself a certain like fatigue in that in the last couple of weeks, that I can't go through that story sort of time and time again, because it also hasn't shifted so much, to be honest, but more to go into a conversation with a question that you might have for the future, or a question that you would like to discuss with your friend or peer. To, yeah, I mean, that has just been a really practical but really helpful thing for me, to even with friends or like family, to go into a conversation with a question that you'd actually like to discuss with them. And that can actually lead to very beautiful conversations of things we might do in the future, and raise our sense of optimism a little bit again.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, good feedback.
We have Sadia, we have you, but I think you gave such a nice big topic to think about, and that relates so nicely to the next time, that it's maybe good to continue, if that's fine with you.
I would just like to thank everyone. I really appreciated everyone's comments and different perspectives. It's been fantastic for me, especially because I realize now at COVID that I had this previous super hyper local perspective, and I would question the relevance of things that were coming from different jurisdictions. And it's like the lockdown happened and kind of someone dropped the magnification on the microscope, and I was looking more broadly, and it was really bewildering, as you can tell. I'm totally bewildered by the situation, but it was also in a very bizarre way. It was good to have that feeling, and so I appreciate experiencing that with you all today, quite literally. So thank you all.
Thank you, Sadia.
So should we close? Should I go through some final? And well, I wanted to thank everybody, all the panelists and the audience. And I also want to announce the next one, which is the 27th of May. And that's going to be 9 o'clock in São Paulo local time. And the subject will be technology. And I've been thinking about what Hendrick mentioned on how we can perhaps use this more as a forum to debate specific questions and maybe optimize our time together. So we'll discuss that. And we do have a good global network, but it's also sometimes challenging to, even with a good network, to find people in different continents. So like if the panelists or the audience can help us to find good people, especially in places like Africa and Asia, that's very helpful, because it's one of our missions here to try and have a very diverse perspective. And we are going to email the recording for those who are in our list. So if you're not and you want to receive the recording, leave us your email. And I think this is, oh, so thank you. I don't know, Maaike, do you want to say anything else to close?
No, I want to thank everyone. It's always super inspiring, and there's always so many things coming up that we cannot talk about, and I'm very sad about that. But and yeah, I'm looking forward to continue this, and also to invite the panelists back later on. You know, that we really create this maze where we speak to different people and continue speaking, not only for a few months, but really over at least a year. So yeah, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
We can all unmute our phones and say thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Não, mas é que eu enviei. Olha, já descobri. Na verdade é útil, só que pá, agora não é muito útil.
Bye bye.
João.
Oi.
Tipo, me explicarem as cenas.
Como é que eu mando o e-mail? Posso mandar para o seu WhatsApp, João?
Pode.
Tá bom.